opportunities for blockchain technology implementation in Africa and the several partnerships they have with several African governments to onboard students and citizens onto the Cardano platform for real-world blockchain implementation. Charles has also funded blockchain research labs worldwide, and he has a profound commitment to the industry and has been instrumental in changing people's perceptions about cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. Charles, I'll hand over to you, and I'll see you towards the end of your session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I'm glad to be here. Hi, everybody. This is Charles Hoskinson, broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. Africa, to me, has been kind of the mission of my life. For a long time, I was always curious about why we have poverty. Why do we have rich nations versus poor nations? And it's a question that economists have been asking for a long time. Political scientists have been asking. It's not connected necessarily to resource wealth. It's not necessarily connected to merit or people or human capital. At the end of the day, it's about systems. And some people are lucky to be born into great systems, and some people are unlucky to be born into bad systems. And systems are tuned for the challenges of their times. So when we look to the African continent this century, it is one of the most exciting opportunities because it's a continent that is hungry for new systems. It's a continent that wants to reimagine the way that everything works, from identity to e-commerce to voting to supply chains to financial systems. It's a continent that's hungry for new ways of verifying things, claims, truth, these things. So to me, it felt like a perfect fit for what we do as an industry. At the end of the day, when you look at things like Bitcoin or Ethereum or Cardano, any of the large cryptocurrencies around, it's not about tokens. It's not about market capitalizations. At the end of the day, it's about systems. We sell, as an industry, an idea that you can remove middlemen. We sell, as an industry, an idea that you're able to somehow do something in a peer-to-peer way instead of relying on some sort of trusted central actor. And in the process of doing that, you need new tools and techniques for truth to ensure that people can trust each other who have never met each other or at times are somewhat adversarial. The problem with global business is that people have to get along, especially people who don't get along, in order for global business to work appropriately. There are perverse incentives. In a supply chain, sometimes people have an incentive to claim that things are a bit fresher than they actually are. Sometimes things get lost or stolen in supply chains. Each node, as things move along in a supply chain, has its own individual incentive. Yet collectively, we rely on these things in order to be able to buy the goods at the supermarket shelf. Collectively, we rely upon these things to trust that the things that we put into our bodies, whether it be medicine or food or otherwise, are safe and effective. If people have perverse incentives, then unfortunately, that doesn't work so well. And we rely upon the strength of institutions and governments and international agreements and audit and oversight in order for this to work properly. We see this in America with Flint, Michigan, where people relied upon clean drinking water, and it turned out it had lead in it. We've seen this in places where children's toys are contaminated and other such things. And this is a global phenomenon. As we embrace globalization, we have so many things we have to do, again, we have to work together in order to work well. So the point of our industry is figuring out, how do you do that without deciding on a king? How do you do that without deciding on a controlling entity? Instead, just allowing the masses to come together. So this was a hypothesis 8 years ago when I did my TED Talk in Bermuda in 2014. And today it's a reality. Our organization and many others have gone all the way across the continent. Last year, I went to South Africa, and I didn't have a chance to go to Johannesburg, but I did go to Cape Town. And then we went to Zanzibar, Burundi, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Egypt. And we had a chance to meet some truly amazing people all across the continent, and government officials, from the president of Burundi and the president of Zanzibar to many in the private industry. For example, the CEO of ShopRite and the leadership of Opera, amongst other companies that have strong African connections. In each place we went, we had discussions about what systems would you like to transfer to better systems. In Kenya, for example, we spent quite a bit of time exploring microfinance. And we have a partner there called Possessia that's based in Nairobi. There, we're working ways to create better lending channels that are not only lower cost, but by removing the middlemen, the interest rates will ultimately go down and the safety for all parties involved get better, while bringing billions of dollars of new liquidity into the economy in the coming decades. And not only did we meet with these people, we've decided to start investing and building with them. And we've already given several loans in the portfolio. And before the end of the year, we think crypto loans will be possible, denominated in stable coins issued on the Cardano network in partnership with many different entities. In Ethiopia, we've had a long-standing relationship with the Ministry of Education. And there, we spent a lot of time asking about what makes a good credential, including not just academic credentials, but also professional licenses and certificates. And we've started a program involving 5 million students in the country and 750,000 teachers to create transnational digital credentials. The success of this program will grow not only for the education sector, but hopefully throughout the entire country, and we'll be bidding on the national ID system as part of the Digital Ethiopia 2025 agenda. Every single person issued these credentials, DIDs, decentralized identifiers, has actually entered the cryptocurrency space as a result, because their credentials are blockchain recognized, portable, and ultimately owned by them, not a centralized actor, allowing them to actually build reputation and credit as they matriculate from K through 12 to adulthood and economic agency. When we look to Burundi, we're doing exactly the same thing, looking at identity. And so we signed an MOU with the Burundian government while in Bujumbura, and we've been in deep discussions about how does one get a national identity system that is digital when there are infrastructure problems. Only 2.5% of the population are currently online with access to smartphones. In Zanzibar, we actually try to solve that very problem with a partner called World Mobile. There, Mickey and his crew have been working diligently for the past few years, putting up telecommunications infrastructure that ultimately will be cooperatively owned, that will be able to provide internet connectivity, not to just the people of the island of Zanzibar, but also for the blue economy, for the fishermen around the island, opening up a whole new series of capabilities and economic growth for the blue economy to prevent overfishing, better yields, to finally enable a cold chain, as well as IoT technology to be embraced in that industry. So it's pretty remarkable to see these things materialize. The techniques and tools used there are ultimately based upon blockchain technology, ISP, instead of a centralized foreign-owned ISP. If this is successful, it can be ported to Burundi. It can be ported all throughout the African continent and actually give Africa the most resilient people's internet, which always evolves and gets faster, but has at its core basic principles that the American and European internet lack. Furthermore, combining this infrastructure with an identity layer means that Africa could be the first continent by 2050 to have credentials that remove the need for passwords and massively reduce the threat of identity theft, one of the biggest problems in the United States and Europe for white-collar crime. In South Africa, we looked at things like relationships with ShopRite, relationships with Opera, and many of the great companies there. In addition, we also have a lot of open discussions about building infrastructure funds. In particular, we've been, for a while, negotiating and building up a dedicated venture capital fund called the A Fund. And this fund will be used to invest in all kinds of ventures, from startups to other such things, throughout a Pan-African focus and many different verticals. as well as do complex deals and joint ventures with many businesses throughout Africa. The great part of investing in Africa is once you develop the domain expertise to be able to get over geopolitical risks and the differences in cultures, you find that there are phenomenal opportunities to create wonderful infrastructure, which ultimately creates lots of high-paying jobs and economic growth, and being downstream of that gets better returns than one would get in Europe or American investments. Furthermore, introducing blockchain technology into this means that you have an audit and oversight level layer on top of the investment, which creates much more certainty in the facts, circumstances, and actors that one has to deal with. So our commitment is enduring, and it continues to grow deeper and deeper every single year as we build relationships across the continent. But what's really amazing is not what we've done, but what the industry as a whole has inspired African entrepreneurs to do. What many people don't understand is when they look at crypto adoption, some of the fastest growing jurisdictions in the world are African countries, like Nigeria, for example, where people are waking up and realizing that crypto can be not only a superior money and store of value, but also a wonderful medium to build e-commerce based businesses, as well as interface with an emerging industry that has gone from nothing to a multi-trillion-dollar valuation in just 13 years. The crypto industry is the fastest growing. Some of my most treasured memories are interacting with local entrepreneurs, local artists across the continent of Africa, from NFT artists that digitize their art and sell it in Lagos, to people in Egypt who are finding new ways to finance their businesses for the problems there. It's pretty remarkable in that respect. And it's speeding up. People also forget that Africa is the youngest continent. The vast majority of many of the nations of sub-Saharan Africa, their population, 70% or more, are at or under the age of 30. And in a digitized world where information flows instantaneously and anyone can get an education online, usually for free, off of Coursera and YouTube and MIT open courseware, it turns out that the skills gap, the knowledge gap, is bridging rapidly. The reality is that if all things are equal and everything is meritocratic, he who works the hardest will win. And that's what we're seeing. Africa is one of the most entrepreneurial of all continents. And in an emerging economy like the crypto economy, this is a match made in heaven. A combination of the right age, the right level of digitization, and the right will. Now, there are many challenges moving forward. There's still tremendous infrastructural issues that have to be resolved, and it forces a lot of innovation. It's hard to sell money and ideas that are digital native in places that still have unreliable internet access. Furthermore, there needs to be a lot of training and education. This is a very complex field because we're not just talking about one thing. We're not just talking about wallets. We're talking about completely new economic and financial systems that touch every aspect of our lives, and they have different assumptions at the core. Consumers for over a century have been trained that when something goes wrong, they have to go to some central authority, whether it be a government or a business, to resolve that issue. In this industry, you are your own bank. In this industry, you are your own identity. You have to make provisions. You're ultimately in the driver's seat, and with great freedom and liberty comes great responsibilities. So consumer education is incredibly important. But let's not forget, ultimately, the enormous benefits. In my own country during COVID, one of the hardest things the IRS and other actors of the Treasury Department had to deal with was simply just giving money to people. In 2020 and 2021, it took months for checks to go out, debates about what to even put on checks. When you have digital wallets and digital identity, you don't have to know where your people are. You just click a button and each and every person in the country can get something. Furthermore, when you have digital wallets and digital identity, at any given moment, a government, a company, any entity that cares to know, has the capacity and the ability to poll and get a verified result of the opinion of the country. There's been some difficult policy over the last 2 years. Lockdowns, shutdowns, institutional failure, and now we contend with wars. Over 25 conflicts in the world, including Ukraine and Ethiopia, amongst others. And these difficult questions, we really have moved beyond them being answered by the few. They require the wisdom of the crowds to be fully resolved. And the only way we're going to get there is with stuff that allows us to pull the will of the masses. That's perhaps one of the greatest emergent properties of the new crypto economy. Once you have these capabilities, not only do they allow you to protect your identity, your economic identity in particular, but also they allow you to protect your voice in ways that you couldn't previously. No one in our industry ultimately can be silenced. We can choose not to listen to people. We can choose not to value the things that they say, but the right to say it, the right to express, the right to associate, and the right to engage in commerce, basic human rights, are preserved, regardless if they're convenient or inconvenient to the few. This is, in essence, my life's work because I see the value it provides to so many. I'd like to change America, and unfortunately, when one lives in a wealthy, powerful nation, that nation seems to think that it knows all the answers and it doesn't need to change itself, even when there are warning signs. Living on the legacy of the past, it seems at times very difficult to change America. It's good to be dealing with so many nations who not only want to change, they want to change for the better, and they are partners ultimately. I have yet to meet a head of state in Africa. I have yet to meet a business leader in Africa who didn't want to do something better. In every engagement, in every place we've gone, there's certainly been strife and conflict. There's certainly been disagreements, but I see a genuine desire to chase the future and a genuine respect that things must be better. And that's why our industry seems to be flourishing. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have opportunities we've never seen before. For example, years ago, the Europeans got together and they created the euro. It was a revolutionary idea, this transnational currency, and it is now a rival of the US dollar. As the world de-dollarizes, it is my belief that a Pan-African currency and that within the next 10 years will materialize. There is a good possibility that such a thing will not be regulated and controlled by some big federated central bank, but rather actually be a cryptocurrency. It is even possible that such a thing could be a private cryptocurrency that emerges organically as a result of increased trade between African nations. The existence of such an artifact would enable the automation of so many things. New markets, new exchanges, new ways of finding liquidity for African businesses like AML and KYC, as well as the ability for people to conduct commerce easily anywhere across the continent without having to worry about particulars of local paper money and ATM infrastructure and so forth. I believe that's coming. And if we work together as entrepreneurs, we can force that outcome, the result of which would mean much more velocity in all the economies, much more liquidity, direct foreign investment, and ultimately higher GDP growth. I also believe that Africa has a chance to be the first continent to be truly carbon neutral. Sometimes when you fall behind, that's a strategic advantage because you don't get laden with the solutions of the past. You have a chance to leapfrog them and build new systems. So while Burundi, for example, only 11% of the country is electrified, if we were to build the other 90% with cooperatively owned and operated alternative energy, it could be one of the most resilient and sustainable energy economies in the world, with everyone having a collective incentive to maintain the infrastructure instead of it being a tragedy of the commons of the few and ultimately an expensive piece of infrastructure. Should this model work, it's definitely possible to export that model throughout the entire continent. We look to things like hunger. Overpopulation is pervasive in Egypt in particular, and there's hyper-urbanization along the Nile River. One of their biggest problems is, how do you feed so many people, and how do you deal with the consequences of hyper-urbanization? Well, emerging technologies will be used. And again, it's a question of control. The thinking of the past says that someone will come and solve it, and that person or entity will own it and ultimately get to decide who gets it and who doesn't. The thinking of the future, the thinking of our industry, is make it something that we all own, we all are responsible for, and we all are treated equally. Despite the fact that I created Cardano, and I've been in this industry for over 8 years now, I have no special access to Cardano or Ethereum or any other project I worked on. I'm treated equally to the poorest amongst us, the new entrants. That's a very special thing. And there really is no human institution ever created that has that notion of equality, fairness, and egalitarianism built within it. All the problems, we can always find solutions. We can always rise to the occasion to solve such things. But embedded within those solutions are ultimately trade-offs and ultimately philosophy about human rights, about equality, about fairness and reciprocity, and what ought to be respected. The magic of what we do as an industry and why this industry is so intoxicating and has grown so quickly is it carries within it a baseline principle instead of don't be evil, can't be evil. And that's why I'm here. And that's why we're here in Africa. And that's why we pursue these things. It's a very exciting lifetime. In addition to being a crypto entrepreneur, I'm also a rancher. I raise bison, 500 buffalo running around my ranch. And I look to agriculture as fondly as I do to cryptography. And what's really amazing is there's so much that can be innovated in agriculture. Africa is still a very strong ag tech sector. And some of the biggest advancements are going to be in that realm. Better ways of raising animals, more sustainable ways, exploring concepts like de-extinction. As some of you are aware, I'm an investor in a company called Colossal, which is a company that specializes in de-extinction. And their flagship is to resurrect the woolly mammoth. Outside of the madness of such things, it really does open up a great series of economic opportunities in the next 5 to 10 years to look at how we can make profit from conservation and how we can preserve the biodiversity of many economies as they grow and transform. One of the big mistakes of Europe and the United States and Asia has been, as we've grown into the modern world, we left behind the natural world. Africa now has to make that same decision as it's growing. And my hope is that the technology of our industry can be used to create new economies that not only are fair for humans, but fair for nature, so that we can properly quantify the cost of the things we do. Traveling through the Wyoming landscape, throughout Colorado and other places, you can find areas that were devastated from the 19th century as a result of strip mining and other such things. It would be a travesty to see, as Africa grows, such things to harm them as well. And it's already occurred in many places as a result of malinvestment. So there's much to do, but the ultimate question is, how do you get involved? There is no credential for blockchain. There is no governing body for blockchain. There is no gatekeeper who gets to decide if you're an entrepreneur or not. Ultimately, it's self-selection. You start with a problem and you start with a philosophy. If your problem involves people who have to work together, there's some trust between them, And your philosophy is that those people should be treated fairly, and there should be controls and checks and balances to prevent the system from growing and becoming corrupted. Sounds like you need a blockchain. And there are plenty of great free pieces of education and materials, conferences to attend that help resolve these things. Now, there's great verticals to explore. One we look at is RealFi. We call that because it's DeFi and actual real users, not yield farmers in New Jersey, but people actually looking to get loans who don't have access otherwise, or conduct financial transactions who are unbanked. This is going to be, in my view, one of the fastest and most dominant areas of the cryptocurrency space. So you don't have to look any further than to the remittance markets and the MFI markets and so forth. And that's certainly a vertical to explore. Other verticals could be connected to social good or regulating the flow of capital as it comes in as a direct foreign investment to ensure that there is truth and credibility behind such things. There's a huge appetite for this. Regardless of what the problem happens to be, you have to make it personal. And then there's over 8,000 options. I built Cardano because I felt that it would provide the best trade-off profile to preserve liberty and still scale to meet the needs of billions. But yet there are other systems, and they have their benefits and their cons. But in any event, many of these systems are suitable for your purposes. So the conferences like this can expose you to different ideas and different entrepreneurs. But I hope you all do succeed, because your success, our success, is the success of the human race. And it allows us to move towards a more optimistic and hopefully better future. In closing, I'm getting real tired of cynicism. I'm an optimistic person, and I've spent years of my life believing in the best of people. I think this is the ultimate divide of whether crypto can be successful or not, blockchain can be successful or not. If you believe people are intrinsically bad and must be controlled and governed by the few, crypto cannot work. If you believe that people are intrinsically good, and you believe that if given the chance and the opportunity, admitting a failure from time to time, that people are pretty good at governing themselves and deserve liberty and freedom, crypto is frankly the only way that we can live in a global economy with peace. And so that's ultimately the decision we all have to make, and we make our bets accordingly. Now, I always save a little bit of time for questions, and I know you guys have been asking a few, so I'll go ahead and go through a few of them for the next 15 minutes. Okay. This one comes from Watu. He said, "This is all very impressive. However, we know that there are critics as well as those who are hesitant. What would you say to those who see this idea of discussing and signing MOUs with African governments as counterintuitive at several levels? Most African populations are have-nots in economic and education level. Won't this push the new systems simply not increase the gap with the haves within the same country?" Yeah, it's a fair point. And there's no lack of entrepreneurs in countries that come in with a savior complex and they say, oh, well, our new technology is ultimately going to save everybody. What makes this different, if it's done correctly, is that you're giving capabilities to people that are not proprietary. When people come in, they try to get ownership and leverage. They try to lock people into a system that once they're locked in, they can control that system indefinitely. It could be a political system. It could be proprietary software. It could be some sort of economic domination like debt diplomacy, as we've seen China do. When someone gets a DID, it's portable. That identity is now useful on Ethereum and Bitcoin and many other systems. It's interoperable amongst more than 35 blockchains, as an example. And it's programmable and user controlled, which means they can take it anywhere. Well, people may lack material wealth. They certainly can now get knowledge quickly. And that's really the crux of it. As long as the access to information is unimpeded and the capacity for education is there, along with the desire to solve, then just by getting people into systems that are open is ultimately the solution. And once they're in, they're going to build their own solutions. So that's kind of a teach a man to fish versus give a man the fish. If you give someone a fish, you fed them for a day. If you teach them how to fish, you fed them for a lifetime. Now, MOUs aren't worth much, and that's why we try to close deals. Like Ethiopia, for example, is not an MOU. It's an active deal, millions of dollars, 5 million customers, and it's growing rapidly. But it did take quite a bit of time to get there. To temper expectations, a government deal from start to finish is a 3 to 7 year endeavor. It's among one of the hardest things people can do. And while you're doing it, there at times can be changes of management. I know a lot of entrepreneurs who spent quite a bit of time, for example, in Ukraine. It's unclear whether those contracts they've signed will even be valid in a month or two, depending upon the outcome of the conflict there. And that's just an example of what can go wrong. So you have to be patient, you have to be systematic, and you have to accept that there will be setbacks. And if it's just one company systematically going one country after another, signing a deal here, signing a deal there, we'll never get there. It requires everybody to pick up a shovel and work and have that Ubuntu spirit. This is a question from Ishan. China's imperial ambitions are quite openly on display in Africa. Does IOHK have a game plan to give nation states their financial freedom from China the same way Cardano gives the freedom to individuals? So it's no secret that China has been engaging in a debt diplomacy. They've put over $1 trillion into the African continent, and they're trying to include African countries in the Belt and Road program. I see this no different from the colonialism of the 19th century from European powers. It's just in different clothing. And while some corrupt leaders have embraced this, I've seen a wholesale rejection of the mainstream populations of many countries in Africa and an attempt to regain the sovereignty and self-determination of the people of the nations. How you get out from underneath debt diplomacy is through better markets and systems that provide competition and liquidity. If your only option is to take direct foreign investment from an imperial power, it's your only option. If you have an alternative that doesn't come with the strings attached, then you actually will almost always pick the alternative. So just by getting blockchain infrastructure into these countries, it allows alternatives to exist and ultimately a restoration of the sovereignty of the nations that have been compromised. What is IOHK's plan on partnering with African commercial banks to accelerate adoption on the continent? We've certainly had many conversations with African banks. Respecting the commercial conversations, I won't mention the particular names, but some are interested in DRC, some are Sub-Sahara, some are in South Africa. And usually these stem around infrastructure like identity infrastructure and compliance infrastructure that would then make them interoperable with crypto in general. We also have had several conversations somewhat related to how this will impact MFI, which is a big income stream of African commercial banks. So we definitely have the ongoing conversations and discussions, and usually it's a multi-phased plan. First is just baseline infrastructure for crypto adoption, and then moving deeper down the line to specific pilots in places. And I suspect our first outlay there will be with something in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but that just depends on that particular partner. For someone who has interest and some understanding and wants to learn more and benefit from this evolution, how does one start? Which trusted wallet and do what from there, or where can you point them to? Just high level. I'd say the easiest place to start, the best place to start would be to go to Coursera, and there are several free classes on cryptocurrencies. One's from Princeton University, which covers Bitcoin and the ecosystem. And then there's some others that have been created by the Blockchain Research Institute. And both of these lines are free and done by very credible people like Don Tapscott and Ed Felton and so forth. And the advantage of these classes, they'll give you a very good understanding of the underlying technology, what makes it so compelling and resilient. And then it just depends on what you want to build from there. If you're a business person, the BRI classes in general will show you some of the business domains that are accessible and easy to solve. If you're a developer, then becoming a smart contract developer is the way to go. And then you'll find a lot of resources within those resources to get started. We're working with the Cardano Foundation as well on pedagogy, and this year and next year, we'll see a lot coming out. Okay. Let's see here. Are we out of time? You're on mute, Sonia.
Sorry.
Oh, that's the video. There we go.
I thought I would just jump in to see if you need any help with the questions, but I think you've gone through most of the questions there, Charles.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Okay, and there's one more question.
Do you have any? All right, you get to pick.
Okay, let me just see. There was one here that I thought looked interesting. Your opinions on CBDCs for Africa? Yeah.
Well, I did cover that briefly, that I think Africa has a chance to do the first pan-African currency that's a cryptocurrency. We've certainly had a lot of CBDC conversations. And what makes CBDCs interesting is that in building a digital CBDC, you can actually connect a social goal along with the usage of the money. For example, what you could do is say any tourist or foreign use of the currency pays a transaction fee, but domestic use does not. And those transaction fees could be paid into a sovereign wealth fund or a universal basic income fund. So in that way, just by having people visit, use your currency, trade your currency, it actually makes the country wealthier for all the citizens and could, on a quarterly basis, pay dividends. That's just simply not possible to do when you deal with legacy assets in the traditional SWIFT system and BIS system and so forth. Another thing is innovation there. You actually can start talking about the separation of a store of value from a means of exchange. So this is what's happening in El Salvador. They've adopted Bitcoin as the store of value for their country, and they're using currently the US dollar as the means of exchange. So day-to-day transactions are still dollarized, but people can store their wealth in Bitcoin, and it's a deflationary asset, so it tends to increase in value over time. I think if you took Bitcoin or something like it and you used it to make an algorithmic stablecoin, you could completely de-dollarize, and you could have a dual economy where you have a place to store value, and then you can convert it real time into an instrument to spend, and then you gain all the values of having a value stable, high velocity currency. So these are the kinds of discussions that we've been having with central banks throughout the world, including El Salvador, about various options and opportunities to build and do interesting things. But in general, I think the first countries to adopt such Africa and Central and South America, they seem to be much ahead of the curve over the European Union or the United States.
Yes, and we saw Nigeria, come out with the e-Naira last year, making it the first African country to have a CBDC, issued currency. Obviously, there's a lot of positives and negatives around that. And I think someone just posted a question here to ask, it sounds like an authoritarian government's dream to control everyone's wallets, the CBDCs. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's why the devil's always in the details. You can build a cryptocurrency in a way that is very centralized and one person has the control over everything. But we already have that. It's called the US dollar. And as we've seen with Russia's sanctions or anything, you could be an oligarch and then suddenly you're broke. So we already live in a financial economy where the international order has pervasive abilities to shut you out very quickly without any rebuttal or oversight, regardless of whether it was a good or bad idea. So CBDCs can be built as a natural extension to make that a more efficient process, especially if you want to replace cash. But on the other hand, if you build them in a different way, they actually can't be shut out. They preserve liberty, just like cash does.
Yes, and I think, we're different to the rest of the world in that we still find cash very important. A large amount of people in Africa still use cash, not credit cards, obviously, because of the high numbers of unbanked and financially excluded people we have in Africa. So cash is still very important. But Charles, I wanted to ask you what your opinion is on stablecoins and its use in Africa, and which stablecoin do you think is the one that could potentially be the more interesting one in Africa?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So there's different categories. There's asset-backed, metastable, and algorithmic. So asset-backed are the things that we tend to think of when we think of stablecoins. So those are things like Tether and Cbdc and USDC and so forth. And they have a lot of market capitalization and liquidity, but they tend to be mostly focused in the Western markets. No, you can use them anywhere, but they have trust in that you trust a central institution to hold the value. And as we've seen with Tether, there's been some questions there. Metastable are when you aggregate a collection of stable coins together and you create a synthetic asset. So you're kind of offsetting your trust a little bit. And there's some interesting opportunities there. But probably the most interesting are the algorithmic stable coins, because what you do is you take a crypto asset and you use that in some way to create a stable crypto asset. And because both sides are crypto and both sides don't have a custodian, you're using the blockchain as it. The trust model is just in the fidelity of the algorithm, not whether the actor is regulated or not. No one can run away with your tokens. So there's been a lot of innovation there. The MakerDAO was an example of that. That's how I got started in this industry. We created something called BitShares, and it had BitUSD. And now we have a stablecoin we've invented called JED, and we're even creating something called the JED Alliance to popularize that. So it's a very fertile area, and hopefully that's the one that gets used. And in my view, I think this dual monetary economy of using a deflationary asset as the nation's store of value and then an algorithmic stablecoin as a means of exchange is definitely the way to go, because it's transnational by default. It has principles. You can't be shut out. There's no custodial risk, and you can automate things like regulation with smart contracts and get a high degree of consumer protection. But you also get all the benefits of a constrained monetary policy. So you'll have low inflation, if not, or even deflation, and you'll have stable value of the underlying asset for lending.
And I think I have one more question here that might be interesting. What is your view on regulation? And have you seen any regulations sort of provide continue innovation in this space that's been, progressive, not too restrictive?
It's a great question. The problem with regulation is that there are contradictory concerns for the regulators. So they look at things like consumer protection, financial stability. They look at things like anti-terrorist financing, but then they also look at geopolitical considerations. So on certain hands, they care a lot about information asymmetries and anti-consumer behavior, but then on other hands, they actually care a lot about keeping large companies in power, because if they fell too quickly, it could destabilize the economy, as you saw in 2008. And then sometimes they care a lot about sanctions and these types of things. So given that you have these four different areas that you're doing things with, whether it be law enforcement and terrorism, or it be financial stability or geopolitical or consumer, it really is hard to build a regulatory structure. And the other thing is regulation tends to be jurisdictional. So, Zambia is different than South Africa, is different than Burundi. Yet in a global economy, you oftentimes will have transnational transactions that cover dozens of countries. My own company, even though we only have 600 people, actually operates in more than 50 countries. So technically, we have to comply with the laws and regulations of more than 50 countries. And that's very contradictory at times. Then, to make matters worse, legacy regulation assumes technology that is very asset oriented. So something is either a currency or a commodity or a stock or something else. It doesn't wake up on Tuesday and say, I want to be a currency today, and then puts its commodity pants on Wednesday and its stock pants on Thursday. So the problem with cryptocurrencies is they can be all of those things. It's kind of the stem cell of finance. And so as a result of the use cases, regulators are having a really hard time actually figuring out how to deal with these chimeric assets. So in general, it's necessary, because completely unregulated markets again and again do fail and are rife with fraud and problems. But it's going to require just as much innovation in reg tech as it does as we've seen in innovation in other areas for cryptocurrencies to work properly.
Charles, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but there's so much we would have liked to discuss with you further. And that is why we'd love to see you in Johannesburg next year, an open invitation for you and your team to be there in person in March next year. Just in closing, I would just like to say, I think to reiterate your words, you said there's much to do. I would agree. There is much to do in Africa. There's a lot of problems in Africa, but we do appreciate your efforts in Africa in bringing Cardano and IOHK here. And, you know, our theme for this conference was ready for business. And I think you might agree that Africa is ready for business, and so is blockchain and crypto. It is ready for business. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for being with us today, and hopefully we see you again at our next conference.
Absolutely. This was so much fun, Sonia. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. Bye.